drummer of Tedworth, Britain's first documented poltergeist. Come in. Sit down. Get comfortable. It is quiet where you are right now. I hope it is quiet. I hope the room around you feels the way rooms are supposed to feel at this hour. Familiar and safe and yours. Because what I'm about to tell you is a story about a man who felt exactly that way about his own home. A magistrate. A respected man. A man with a house and a family and the particular confidence that comes from being someone who enforces the law rather than someone the law is enforced against. His name was John Mompesson. He lived in Tedworth in Wiltshire, England. The year was 1661, and something was coming for him that he had been warned about and had not taken seriously enough. He was about to take it very seriously indeed. This is the drummer of Tedworth. It is Britain's first documented poltergeist case. It was famous enough in its own time that Samuel Pepys, the most celebrated diarist in English history, recorded his wife reading it aloud to him on Christmas Day 1667. It was investigated by royal appointment, documented by a clergyman who was present during the events, and published in a book that was read across England and beyond for generations, and it has never been given the serious, long-form treatment it deserves. Until tonight, the night it began, John Mompesson was in his house at Tedworth alone. His wife and children were away. The servants had gone to bed. The house was quiet in the way that old English country houses are quiet at midnight. Thick walls, small windows, the sounds of the world outside reduced to nothing by stone, and darkness and distance. He was in bed when he heard it, not outside. Not a sound from the street or the fields or the night beyond the windows. Inside, in the walls of his own house, a drumming, rhythmic, deliberate, purposeful. The sound of a drum being beaten by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and intended to be heard. He lay still for a moment, listening, trying to locate it, trying to find a frame for it, a sound he knew, a source he could identify, something that belonged in the category of things that have explanations. He could not find one because he already knew what it was. 3 weeks earlier, a vagrant drummer named William Drury had looked John Mompesson in the eye and told him exactly what was coming. He had said it with a particular calm of a man who knows things that other people do not know and is content to wait for events to prove him right. Mompesson had not believed him. He believed him. Now, to understand what happened at Tedworth between 1661 and 1663, you need to understand that England had happened in. Because the England of 1661 was not the England of today, and the difference matters more than you might think. Charles II had been restored to the throne the previous year, ending 11 years of Puritan Commonwealth rule that had closed the theaters and banned Christmas and brought Oliver Cromwell's particular brand of joyless religious severity to bear on every aspect of English public life. The Restoration was a moment of cultural exhale. The theaters reopened. The parties resumed. The long gray years of Puritan England gave way to something more colorful and more complicated. But underneath the celebration, the anxieties of the age persisted. England in 1661 was a country that believed in witchcraft, not as a metaphor or a folk superstition, but as a real and legally prosecutable category of human action. The last major English witch trial had been only 14 years earlier. The idea that a person could, through compact with the devil, cause harm to others at a distance, through curses, through malefic action, through the direction of supernatural forces against specific individuals, was not the fringe belief of the uneducated. It was the operating assumption of the legal system, the church, and the educated establishment. John Mompesson was a magistrate. He was an educated man of some standing. He had opinions about witchcraft that were the opinions of his time, not skeptical in the modern sense, not credulous in the village sense, but somewhere in the middle where educated Restoration England tended to land on questions of the supernatural. He believed that the devil was real. He believed that witchcraft was possible. He did not necessarily believe that the ragged drummer he had arrested in the market town of Wiltshire was capable of it. He was wrong about that. The story of what happened at Tedworth begins not in Tedworth at all, but in the market town of Wiltshire, some miles away, on a day in the spring of 1661. When John Mompesson was attending to his duties as a magistrate, William Drury was there. He was a traveling showman, a drummer, a juggler, a performer of various small entertainments who made his living moving from town to town, playing wherever people would pay attention and passing the hat for whatever they would give. He had a drum. It was his primary instrument and his primary tool for attracting the attention of the crowds he needed to earn his living. He beat it loudly and rhythmically in public spaces, and people stopped to watch and listen and sometimes gave a money dot on this particular day in Wiltshire. William Drury had been beating his drum in the market square and collecting money from the townspeople, and this had attracted the attention of the local constables, who felt, not entirely without justification, that the collecting of money in this manner without proper authorization was a form of fraud. They had him arrested. Mompesson was brought in to assess the situation. He examined Drury's papers. He found them to be not entirely in order, the passes and certificates that traveling performers were required to carry in. Restoration England, to establish their legitimacy, were either forged or improperly obtained, and Mompesson concluded that Drury had been collecting money under false pretenses. He confiscated the drum. This was the moment. This was the specific action, a magistrate taking a drummer's drum, that set everything in motion. And Drury, who was being held while the matter was sorted out, made a point of letting Mompesson know that he understood what had been done to him and that he did not intend to let it pass without consequence. He told Mompesson, in terms that were clear enough to be remembered and recorded, that he would be heard from, that Mompesson would regret what he had done, that the drum was not simply a drum, and taking it was not simply a matter of confiscating a performer's equipment. He said it without rage, without the desperation of a man in genuine distress. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had resources that Mompesson could not see and would not understand until they were directed at him. Mompesson had him released eventually, and the matter seemed to be concluded. Drury was gone. The drum was disposed of, sent, rather carelessly as it turned out, to Mompesson's house at Tedworth, because there was nowhere else immediately obvious to put it. Mompesson did not particularly want it in his house, but it arrived, and it was put somewhere, and the household moved on. And then the drumming started. The first night it was in the walls, just the walls. A rhythmic beating that Mompesson could not locate because it seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, from the east wall of the bedroom, from the ceiling above him, from the floor below. He got up and searched the house. He found nothing. He went back to bed. The drumming continued. The second night, it was louder. By the end of the first week, the entire household had heard it. The servants were frightened. Mompesson's wife, who had returned with the children, was frightened. Mompesson himself was frightened in the way that practical men get frightened when something they cannot explain refuses to go away, not with the sharp, immediate fear of a physical threat, but with the slow, grinding anxiety of a man who is beginning to understand that his world contains something he did not account for. He searched for explanations. He searched the house systematically for any concealed person who might be producing the sounds. He found nothing. He had the structure examined for anything that could account for the rhythmic beating, pipes, mechanical elements, structural defects. Nothing. He brought in neighbors to listen and confirm what he was hearing. They confirmed it. They could not explain it either. The drumming continued every night for weeks. It was loudest in the early hours, between midnight and 3 in the morning, and it followed. No pattern that anyone could identify as natural or mechanical. It moved through the house. It would begin in one place and then be heard in another, as though whatever was producing it was ambulatory, moving through the fabric of the building itself, tracking from room to room with a purpose that felt deliberate and directed. And then it found the children. The children's room was at the back of the house. Mompesson had put his family there, partly from habit, and partly from the specific hope that if the drumming was concentrated in the front of the house, where it had been most active in the early weeks, the children at the back might be somewhat insulated from it. They were not. The drumming appeared in their room on a night in the second month of the haunting, and from that point, it did not leave. Night after night, the children lay in their beds, listening to the sound in the walls around them, in the floor beneath them, and the ceiling above their heads. They were young. The youngest was not yet old enough to understand what was happening to their house. The oldest were old enough to be terrified, And then something worse than the drumming happened. The children were lifted from their beds, not all at once, not every night, but consistently enough and witnessed by enough people that it became one of the most documented elements of the Tedworth haunting. Mompesson himself witnessed it. Servants witnessed it. Visitors who came to the house and stayed the night witnessed it. The children would be in their beds, and then they would not be, raised by some force that none of the witnesses could see, held in the air above their mattresses, set down again, sometimes gently, sometimes not. One of the children, Mompesson's daughter, was lifted repeatedly over the course of several weeks. She was moved from her bed to a chair, from the chair back to the bed, from one end of the room to the other. She was conscious during these movements. She was aware of what was happening to her, and she could not stop it, and neither could anyone else in the room who tried to intervene. Because whatever was lifting her was not a thing at human hands, could reach, or human strength could resist. She was a child in her own bedroom, in her family's house, being moved around by something invisible in the dark. Think about that, Dot. At the same time, the other phenomena in the house escalated. Objects moved, boards were lifted from the floor, shoes were thrown across rooms, lights appeared, small, localized, unexplained illuminations in dark corners of rooms that had no light source. Sulfurous smells were reported in the bedroom passages. A scratching sound, different from the drumming, more intimate, more close, was heard beneath the children's beds, as though something was moving under them. And then a shape was seen. Joseph Glanville, the clergyman who would become the primary documentarian of the Tedworth haunting, recorded the account of a visitor to the house who saw a shape in the darkness of the main bedroom. Not a clear figure, not something that could be described with the precision that a well-lit apparition allows. A darkness within the darkness, a form that was present when it should not have been and gone the next moment. The visitor described it as the shape of a man, but not quite. Something approximating a man in its dimensions and its bearing, but wrong in its specific details in a way that they found impossible to put precisely into language. Glanville wrote it all down. Joseph Glanville was not a fool. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific body in England, founded only the previous year by Charles II with the specific purpose of advancing knowledge through empirical investigation. He was a Church of England clergyman, and he was a scholar, and he brought both his religious framework and his commitment to empirical observation to bear on what he was investigating at Tedworth. He was not credulous. He was not there to be frightened into belief. He was there to document what was actually happening and to assess it as honestly as he could. What he found convinced him, not that the devil was literally in the house at Tedworth, not that William Drury had specifically and technically practiced witchcraft in the precise theological sense, but that something was happening in that house that he could not account for through any invent. M1L means available to him, and that the weight of the evidence, the number of witnesses, the consistency of the accounts, the specific and repeatable nature of the phenomena was sufficient to take seriously as a genuine, documented phenomenon. He wrote his account. He published it in 1668 in a book called Sadducismus Triumphatus, a title that translates roughly as the triumph over Sadducism. Sadducism being the theological position that denied the existence of spirits and the supernatural. The book was a direct argument, made through documented case studies, of which Tedworth was the centerpiece, that the supernatural was real, and that the evidence for it was stronger than the skeptics of the age wished to admit. It was read across England. It went through multiple editions. It was read in America. It influenced the intellectual climate around witch trials in ways that historians still debate. And it was the account that Pepys' wife read aloud to him by the fireside on Christmas Day, 1667. Which tells you something about how famous the Tedworth case was in its own time. Famous enough to be considered appropriate festive reading for the most socially connected diarist in England. The king heard about it. This is the detail that separates the drummer of Tedworth from almost every other 17th century haunting case. Kings do not typically send investigators to look at ghost stories. They send investigators when the ghost story has become sufficiently public and sufficiently credible that ignoring it would itself be a statement. Charles II sent investigators to Tedworth because the case had reached a level of public prominence that required a royal response. The investigators arrived. They were men of standing, not credulous country people, but educated restoration. Gentlemen sent by the crown to assess what was happening in a magistrate's house in Wiltshire. They settled in, they stayed. They listened and watched and investigated with the thoroughness that a royal commission demands, and the drumming stopped completely, immediately. From the moment the king's men arrived at the house at Tedworth, the phenomena ceased. The drumming that had been occurring every night for months was simply not there. The children slept undisturbed. The shape in the darkness did not appear. The scratching under the beds was silent. The house was what it appeared from the outside, to be an ordinary English country house, quiet and unremarkable, inhabited by a family who seemed entirely normal and a magistrate who seemed slightly embarrassed. The king's investigators spent their time at the house and found nothing. They reported back that the stories of the Tedworth haunting appeared to be exaggerated or unfounded. Some of them concluded that Mompesson himself had fabricated the whole thing, for reasons that were not entirely clear, but that skeptics of the period were inclined to speculate about. The implication was fraud. The house was quiet. There was nothing to see. Case closed, and then the king's men left. The drumming resumed that same night, not the following week, not gradually over a period of days. That same night, as though whatever was in the house had been waiting with perfect patience for the investigators to go, and had resumed operations the moment they cleared the gate. This pattern of phenomena ceasing in the presence of official investigators and resuming immediately upon their departure is one that appears in other well-documented paranormal cases, and that investigators have found consistently difficult to account for within any conventional framework. If the phenomena were being produced by a human agent, Mompesson, a servant, one of the children, then that human agent would need to have stopped producing them for the entire duration of the investigators. Stay and resumed producing them the moment the investigators left, without the investigators noticing the cessation as suspicious, without resuming too quickly upon their departure to be credible, with a timing so precise that the resumption appeared to be the work of something that had been watching and waiting. That is possible. Human beings are capable of sustained deception and careful timing. But the Tedworth case presents this pattern against a background of phenomena that had been witnessed by many independent people under too many varied conditions to be easily attributed to a single human agent's covert activity. The phenomena had been witnessed in the full light of day as well as at night. They had been witnessed by visitors who arrived unannounced. They had been witnessed in rooms that Mompesson was not in. They had been witnessed by the clergyman Glanville, who arrived specifically to look for fraud in documented phenomena that he could not attribute to it. The king's investigators left. The drumming returned, and the Mompesson family continued to live in their house with whatever was there, because they had no choice, and because the house was their home, and because in the England of 1661, you did not simply pack up and leave your house because of a drum you could not see. While the drumming continued at Tedworth, William Drury was in prison. He had been arrested again, not for the original offense at Wiltshire, but for theft, a separate crime that had caught up with him in the course of his travels. He was in Gloucester jail, which was far from Tedworth, and should by any conventional understanding have placed him entirely outside the chain of causation for what was happening in Mompesson's house. But Drury, in Gloucester jail, was talking. He was talking to his fellow prisoners. He was talking to the guards. He was talking to anyone who would listen. And what he was saying was not the protestations of an innocent man falsely accused, or the complaints of a man unjustly imprisoned. He was boasting. He told people in that jail that he was making Mompesson's life a misery. He described what was happening at the house in Tedworth with a specificity and an accuracy that his listeners found remarkable, given that he was in a cell in Gloucester and had no apparent means of knowing anything about what was occurring in Wiltshire. He described the drumming, described the children. He described the nights that had become unbearable for a family that had done nothing to him except that their father had enforced the law. He said he would continue until he was satisfied. Word of Drury's boasts reached the authorities. The correlation Between what he was saying in his cell and what was being reported at Tedworth was impossible to ignore. A formal investigation was initiated. Drury was examined on the charge of witchcraft, which in the England of 1661 was a serious charge that carried serious consequences. The laws against witchcraft having been reinforced rather than relaxed in the previous decades, the examination was thorough. Drury was questioned about his knowledge of events at Tedworth. He could not explain how he knew what he knew. He could not produce a conventional explanation for the accuracy of his descriptions of phenomena occurring in a house he had not visited since his drum was confiscated months earlier. He maintained a defiant rather than a terrified posture, not the behavior of a man who believed he was facing false accusations, but the behavior of a man who was comfortable with the knowledge he possessed and was not particularly concerned about what happened next. He was tried. He was convicted, not specifically of the Tedworth witchcraft, but of the theft charge that had initially brought him back into custody, and the witchcraft conviction was complicated by the evidentiary standards of the period. He was sentenced to transportation, deportation to the American colonies, which in the England of 1661 was a punishment intended to remove the convicted person from England permanently and place them beyond the reach of whatever influence they had been exercising. They put William Drury on a ship and sent him away. The drumming at Tedworth stopped, not gradually, not over the course of a few weeks as the haunting wound down. It stopped. The night after Drury's ship left English waters, the house at Tedworth was quiet. The children slept in their beds. The shape in the darkness did not appear. The scratching under the beds was gone. The house was simply a house again, occupied by a family that had endured 2 years of something they could not explain and that had now apparently ended. Mompesson rebuilt. The family recovered. The house returned to what it had been before. The drum arrived at its door. Life resumed. And then Drury escaped. He escaped from the ship or from the colonial settlement. The accounts differ on the precise mechanism, and made his way back to England. He was a man who had skills that conventional society underestimated. Getting back across the Atlantic in the 1660s was not a simple matter, but Drury managed it. He returned to England. He was back on English soil. The drumming at Tedworth resumed. That same week, not immediately, there was a brief period, perhaps of travel, perhaps of Drury establishing himself back in England, before whatever it was that connected him to the house at Tedworth reactivated, but it returned. And when it returned with the same specific character it had always had, the rhythmic beating in the walls, the sounds in the children's room, the sense of a presence in the house that Mompesson and his family had hoped they had. Seeing the last of Drury was recaptured. He was put back on a ship. He was deported again, this time with more thorough arrangements for ensuring he stayed where he was sent. The drumming at Tedworth stopped again. And this time it did not return. Joseph Glanville published his account of the Tedworth case in 1668. He had been gathering material for years by that point, interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents, corresponding with Mompesson and with others who had been present at the house during the 2 years of the haunting. His book, Sedicismus Triumphatus, was a scholarly work in the tradition of the Royal Society, assembling evidence and argument in the service of a specific intellectual position, that the existence of spirits and supernatural phenomena was demonstrable through accumulated testimony, and that the skeptics who denied this were not the rational voices they presented themselves as, but were themselves operating from an unjustified philosophical prejudice. The Tedworth case was his strongest exhibit. He had been there himself. He had spent nights in the house. He had heard the drumming. He had examined the structure of the building for conventional explanations and found none. He had spoken to the children and the servants and the neighbors and the visitors who had been at the house during the worst of the phenomena. He had compiled a record that was, for its time, remarkably systematic and remarkably honest about the uncertainties involved. He did not claim more than he could document. He did not attribute specific supernatural causes where the evidence did not support them, and he acknowledged the possibility of fraud while arguing that the totality of the evidence made fraud an insufficient explanation. His account was challenged. It was challenged immediately and vigorously by the skeptics of the Restoration period, who argued that the Tedworth phenomena were fraudulent. that Mompesson had fabricated or exaggerated everything for reasons of vanity or notoriety, and that Glanville had been credulous and insufficiently rigorous in his investigation. The skeptic John Webster published a direct rebuttal. The argument between Glanville and his critics was one of the liveliest intellectual controversies of the late 17th century, and it touched on questions about the nature of evidence, the reliability of testimony, and the relationship between empirical investigation and supernatural belief that are still relevant today. What neither side could fully account for was the Drury correlation. The skeptical position required that Mompesson had fabricated the phenomena, but the correlation between Drury's presence in England and the occurrence of the phenomena, and between his departure and their cessation, was not something that Mompesson could easily have manufactured. Mompesson had no reliable way of knowing when Drury left England on the first transportation. He had no reliable way of knowing when Drury escaped and returned. The resumption of the phenomena on those specific occasions was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of a genuine connection between Drury and what was happening at the house. Glanville was also careful to note that Drury's boasts in Gloucester jail, his specific and accurate descriptions of events at a house he had not visited, were themselves a form of evidence that the skeptical position had to account for. If Mompesson was fabricating everything, how did Drury in Gloucester know the specific details he described? And if Drury knew the specific details without having been at the house, what was the mechanism of his knowledge? The skeptics did not have a satisfying answer to this question. They did not have one then. Nobody has one now. Glanville died in 1680, 12 years after publishing Sadicismus Triumphatus. He had spent those years defending his account and his methodology against sustained criticism from the skeptical establishment. He did not retract what he had written. He did not moderate his conclusions under the pressure of the criticism. He had been at the house at Tedworth. He had heard what he heard and seen what he saw and spoken to the people he had spoken to, and he was not prepared to unsay any of it. Mompesson outlived the haunting by decades. He remained in Tedworth. He did not seek to profit from the attention the case had brought him. If anything, the attention and the accusation of fraud that the skeptics had directed at him were things he found more burdensome than flattering. He had been a respected magistrate in his county. He had become, in the public imagination, either the victim of a genuine supernatural assault or the perpetrator of an elaborate hoax. Neither category was comfortable, and he spent the rest of his life in neither confirming nor denying, simply living in his house on the other side of the worst 2 years of his life. Let us do what we always do at this point in the story. Let us look at what the evidence actually supports and what it does not. The fraud hypothesis is the starting point for any honest examination of the Tedworth case. Mompesson had means and opportunity. He lived in the house. He could have arranged for someone to produce the drumming sounds through concealed mechanical means. He could have coached his children and servants to report phenomena that were not occurring. He could have staged the incidents that visitors witnessed, but the fraud hypothesis runs into the same problems. It always runs into when applied to a case with this many independent witnesses over this long a period. 2 years is a long time to maintain a sophisticated hoax. The number of witnesses is too large for a coordinated deception to be credible. Too many people from too many different backgrounds and too many different relationships to the Mompesson family reporting the same phenomena independently. The phenomena occurred in conditions that made concealment extremely difficult in daylight, in the presence of visitors who arrived without warning, in rooms that Mompesson was not in, and the Drury correlation cannot be explained by fraud. If Mompesson was producing the phenomena himself, then the stopping and starting of those phenomena in direct correlation with Drury's transportation and escape and recapture was either the most remarkable coincidence in the history of English. Paranormal cases are evidence that Mompesson somehow had real-time knowledge of Drury's movements across the Atlantic, knowledge that he could not plausibly have had. The natural explanation for the drumming, concealed pipes, structural resonance, some acoustic property of the house at Tedworth that produced rhythmic sounds under certain conditions, was examined by investigators at the time and found insufficient. The drumming moved through the house. It responded to the presence of specific people. It stopped and started in correlation with external events that a structural acoustic phenomenon could not track. The psychological explanation that the entire household was experiencing a shared delusion generated by the stress of the initial haunting claim and sustained by mutual reinforcement accounts for some of the phenomena, but not for the physical incidents. Children cannot be lifted from beds by shared delusion. Objects cannot be moved by collective suggestion. The physical evidence, the marks, the moved objects, the lifted children requires a physical cause. The witchcraft explanation that William Drury genuinely possessed some form of ability to project harm at a distance through mechanisms that current science does not recognize is the explanation that the people of 1661 England found most natural and that modern researchers find most difficult to engage with seriously. But it is the explanation that most directly accounts for the Drury correlation, the most specifically documented and most specifically unexplained element of the entire case, because that correlation is the thing that the Tedworth case keeps coming back to. Remove the Drury correlation, and you have a haunting case with many witnesses and no particularly unique features. Keep the Drury correlation, and you have something different. Evidence of a connection between a specific human being and a specific sequence of physical events that operated across distance and that responded to changes in that person's circumstances with a precision that conventional frameworks cannot account for. William Drury was transported. The drumming stopped. William Drury escaped and returned. The drumming resumed. William Drury was recaptured and deported again. The drumming stopped for good. 3 events, 3 corresponding changes in the phenomena, 3 data points that align with the explanation that was considered most natural in 1661 and most uncomfortable in 2025. What do you do with that? It is late. I want you to stay with me for just a little longer, because this is the part of the story that matters most. Not the drumming, not the children lifted from their beds, not even the shape in the darkness that the visitor saw and could not put into language. This is the part about what the evidence actually means, and the evidence at Tedworth is the most uncomfortable kind. Not because it is dramatic, not because it involves glowing shapes or voices from nowhere or bite marks with foreign saliva. The evidence at Tedworth is uncomfortable because it is simple. 3 events, 3 corresponding outcomes, so clean and so direct that the people who want to dismiss it have to work harder than the people who want to believe it. William Drury was transported across the Atlantic. The drumming stopped. William Drury escaped and came back to England. The drumming resumed. William Drury was recaptured and sent away again. The drumming stopped forever. That is the Tedworth case. Stripped of everything else, the witnesses, the children, the royal investigators, the clergyman, Samuel Pepys by his fireside, what remains is that sequence. 3 movements, 3 responses. A connection between one man and one house that operated across an ocean and responded to changes in his circumstances with a precision that no conventional explanation has ever accounted for. Think about what that means. If Mompesson was producing the phenomena himself, he needed to know when Drury left England. He needed to know when Drury escaped and returned. He needed to know when Drury was recaptured. He needed that information in real time across thousands of miles of ocean in 1661, without telegraph or telephone or any communication faster than a ship. He needed it precisely enough to stop and start the phenomena at exactly the right moments to maintain the correlation. And he needed to have done all of this for 2 years while living in a house that was terrifying his family, disturbing his children, destroying his reputation as a sober and reliable magistrate, and generating accusations of fraud that followed him for the rest of his life. Why would a man do that to himself? The skeptics have never answered this satisfactorily. The fraud hypothesis requires a motive, and no convincing motive has ever been produced. Mompesson did not profit from the Tedworth case. He did not seek fame. He did not write a book or give lectures or establish himself as a figure of paranormal authority. He was a magistrate who wanted his life back and spent 2 years not having it. and then finally got it back and was grateful and quiet about it for the rest of his days. Joseph Glanville wrote the book. Mompesson just lived in the house. And Glanville, the fellow of the Royal Society, the empiricist, the man trained to look for evidence and follow it wherever it led, concluded that the evidence at Tedworth pointed somewhere that made him uncomfortable, and that he was going to say so publicly regardless of who challenged him. He was challenged. He did not back down. He hadn't been in that house. He had heard the drumming in the walls with his own ears. He had spoken to the children. He had seen the conditions under which the phenomena occurred and had examined those conditions for fraud as carefully as he knew how and had not found it. He wrote it all down and put his name on it and published it and let the argument come. It came. It has never stopped. 360 years after the first drumbeat was heard in the walls of John Mompesson's house in Wiltshire, the argument is still going, not loudly, not in the mainstream. In the specific places where people who take evidence seriously sit with cases that evidence cannot close and try. To understand what they're looking at 3 events and 3 corresponding outcomes. They're looking at a vagrant drummer in Gloucester jail describing with specific accuracy the events occurring in a house in Wiltshire that he had not visited in months. They're looking at children lifted from beds in front of witnesses. They are looking at a royal commission that found nothing because the thing they were looking for had the awareness to go quiet while they were there and the patience to wait until they left. They're looking at something that knew it was being watched. That is the detail that stays with me, not the drumming, not the children. The fact that whatever was in that house in Wiltshire understood the difference between the presence of official investigators and the absence of official investigators and adjusted its behavior accordingly. That level of awareness, that responsiveness to the specific social and institutional context of the investigation is not a property of a structural acoustic phenomenon. It is not a property of a collective delusion. It is not a property of a human agent producing sounds through concealed mechanical means, who would have had no way of knowing the precise moment the king's men arrived and departed. It is a property of something that was paying attention. Whatever was in the house at Tedworth was paying attention. To Mompesson, to his family, to the children in their beds, to the investigators who arrived and left, to William Drury on the other side of an ocean. It was paying attention to all of it, and it was responding, and it was doing so with a patience and a precision that 3.5 centuries of investigation have not explained. William Drury told John Mompesson what was coming. He said it calmly. He said it with certainty. He was right about everything that followed. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. Not what was in the house, not whether William Drury was a witch in the 17th century legal sense or a paranormal practitioner in the modern research sense, or simply a man with an ability that neither framework adequately describes. The question is simpler than that. When William Drury looked at John Mompesson in that market square in Ligurgel in the spring of 1661 and told him he would be heard from, was he making a threat or was he making a promise? Because there is a difference. A threat is something you intend to carry out. A promise is something you know you will carry out because you already understand the mechanism that will fulfill it. Drury knew. He knew before any of it happened. He described it before it began. He was right about every detail. He sat in a jail cell in Gloucester and described the inside of a house in Wiltshire with the confidence of someone watching it happen in real time. What was William Drury looking at when he closed his eyes in that cell? What did he see? The house at Tedworth is still there. It is called Tedworth now, and the village around it has changed, and the England that produced John Mompesson and Joseph Glanville and William Drury is as remote from the present as a dream you cannot quite recall. But the house is still there, and the record is still there. And the question Drury answered before anyone thought to ask it is still sitting in the archive, 360 years later, waiting for someone to explain how he knew. No one. Drusen, go to sleep, but perhaps leave a light on tonight. Just in case.